The Atlantic swells crashed against the steel hulls of over 100 Allied vessels. As they cut through the darkness toward the Moroccan coast, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison gripped the railing of the transport ship USS Leonard Wood, his knuckles white against the salt-crusted metal. The date was November 7, 1942. An operation torched the largest amphibious assault in military history. Up to that point was about to begin. Morrison watched the phosphorescent wake trail behind their massive convoy, knowing that somewhere in that churning darkness lay the fate of the entire war. The Western Task Force, commanded by Major General George Smith Patton, Jr., carried 35,000 American troops toward 3 landing zones along the French-Moroccan coast. Their primary objective: capture the strategic port of Casablanca and neutralize Vichy French resistance. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison that they were about to attack fellow Allied forces. The French troops defending Morocco weren't Nazis. They were soldiers caught in the impossible position of serving the collaborationist Vichy government while their homeland suffered under German occupation. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had spent months in diplomatic negotiations, hoping French forces would lay down their arms without a fight. Those hopes were about to be tested by bullets and blood. As dawn broke over the Atlantic on November 8th, the massive armada revealed itself like a steel horizon. Transport ships, destroyers, cruisers, and the battleship USS Massachusetts stretched as far as the eye could see. The sight should have been inspiring, but Morrison felt only the weight of uncertainty. Intelligence reports suggested the French might surrender without resistance, but Admiral François Michelier, commanding French naval forces in Casablanca, had already proven his determination to fight. The first landing craft hit the water at 0400 hours, their diesel engines growling as they formed attack formations in the pre-dawn darkness. Morrison climbed down the cargo nets with his men, feeling the spray of cold Atlantic water as waves crashed against the landing craft's steel bow. Around him, young soldiers many seeing combat for the first time checked their weapons with trembling hands. According to military historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account in the Tours War, the success of Operation Torch would determine whether the Allies could establish a second front against Germany and prevent Axis forces from controlling the entire Mediterranean. The coastal batteries of El Henk Fortress loomed in the distance, their massive guns already tracking the approaching fleet. French destroyer Albatros moved into attack position, her crew preparing for what many hoped would never come: Frenchmen fighting Americans, while Nazi forces occupied their homeland. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on commanders from both sides. Morrison's landing craft lurched forward through the surf, heading toward Fedala Beach. Behind them, the guns of USS Augusta and USS Brooklyn trained on French positions, ready to provide covering fire. The young lieutenant colonel had studied the intelligence reports obsessively. They faced approximately 60,000 French colonial troops, supported by modern aircraft and naval vessels. The outcome was far from certain. As the first rays of sunlight painted the Moroccan coastline gold, Morrison could see French soldiers moving into defensive positions along the beaches. In less than an hour, Operation Torch would begin, and with it, one of the most controversial battles of the Second World War: Americans fighting Frenchmen. While both nations' true enemy controlled much of Europe, the first shots of the Battle of Casablanca rang out at 0-6-15 hours on November 8, 1942, shattering the morning calm along the Moroccan coast. French shore batteries at El Henk Fortress opened fire on the approaching American fleet, their shells screaming overhead and sending towering waterspouts skyward. As they crashed into the Atlantic, Captain Robert English, commanding the destroyer USS Wilkes, felt his ship shudder as French shells bracketed his position. The irony of the moment struck him forcefully. He was trading fire with sailors who should have been allies, men who undoubtedly despised the German occupation of their homeland as much as any American. Yet here they were, fulfilling their duty to the Vichy government with deadly precision. The massive guns of USS Massachusetts answered immediately, her 16-inch shells thundering toward the French battleship Jean Bart, anchored in Casablanca harbor. The incomplete French vessel, still undergoing repairs, represented a significant threat to the invasion fleet. Her 15-inch guns could devastate the transport ships carrying American troops toward the beaches. On Fedala Beach, the first wave of American landing craft ground against the sandy shore under withering machine gun fire. Sergeant Thomas Riley leaped from his Higgins boat into waist-deep water, his Thompson submachine gun held high above the surf. French colonial troops, many of them Moroccan and Senegalese soldiers led by French officers, had prepared excellent defensive positions along the waterline. The sound of automatic weapons fire mixed with the crash of artillery. As American troops struggled to establish their beachhead, many of the French defenders fought with the same desperate courage they had shown against German forces in 1940. But now the courage was directed against their would-be liberators. Political complexities meant nothing to the men bleeding in the sand they fought, because their orders demanded it. Riley dug behind a concrete seawall as bullets whined overhead, sand and concrete chips raining down on his helmet. Beside him, Private Danny Coleman, barely 19 years old, clutched his rifle with shaking hands. "Why are they shooting at us, Sarge?" Coleman shouted over the gunfire. "Aren't they supposed to be our friends?" The question haunted every American soldier on those beaches. They had trained to fight Germans and Italians, not French men who might have brothers in the resistance or relatives in Nazi concentration camps. Yet the deadly reality remained. French colonial troops were fighting with remarkable determination, turning what many had hoped would be a peaceful occupation into a bloody battle. Meanwhile, in Casablanca harbor, French Admiral Francois Michelier coordinated the naval defense from his headquarters. The destroyer Albatross and several submarines moved to attack positions, their crews knowing they faced overwhelming odds, but determined to honor their duty. The moral burden weighed heavily on French officers who found themselves defending Vichy territory against American forces that might eventually liberate France itself. USS Brooklyn engaged the Jean Bart in a fierce artillery duel, her 6-inch guns hammering the anchored battleship, while French return fire straddled the American cruiser. Smoke and flame erupted from both vessels as they traded devastating blows. The Jean Bart, despite her incomplete state, proved a formidable opponent, her experienced gunner scoring several hits on American ships. As reported in wartime correspondence dispatches, the intensity of French resistance surprised American commanders who had hoped for token opposition. The beach landings, planned to be completed within hours, stretched into a grinding battle of attrition as French machine gun nests and artillery positions extracted a heavy toll from the assault forces. By noon, American casualties were mounting steadily. Many soldiers later reported feeling conflicted about firing on men who might have been natural allies under different circumstances. Yet the battle continued with unrelenting fury, as both sides honored their respective duties regardless of the political ironies involved. The naval battle intensified dramatically as November 8th wore on, with American and French warships locked in deadly combat across Casablanca's strategic harbor. Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt, commanding the Western Naval Task Force, watched from the bridge of USS Augusta as his fleet engaged French forces in what would become one of the war's most politically complex naval engagements. By evening, American forces had pushed approximately 1 mile inland from Fedala Beach, but at tremendous cost. Casualty reports showed over 400 American dead and wounded, while French losses remained difficult to estimate due to the fluid nature of the fighting. The beachhead remained precarious, with French forces maintaining strong positions that could threaten American supply lines. The moral burden weighed heavily on both sides as night fell over the contested territory. American soldiers dug foxholes knowing they might face renewed attacks from men whose ultimate loyalty lay with a France they hoped to liberate, while French colonial troops prepared for dawn assaults against forces that might eventually drive the Germans from their homeland. As darkness fell on November 8, 1942, the ancient city of Casablanca found itself caught between hammer and anvil. American forces pressed inland from their contested beachheads, while French colonial troops prepared defensive positions throughout the urban area. The civilian population, a mixture of French colonists, Moroccan Arabs, and Jewish refugees from Nazi persecution, huddled in their homes. As artillery shells screamed overhead, Major General George Smith Patton, Jr. established his command post 3 miles inland from Fedala Beach, studying intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of the battle ahead. French resistance had proven far more determined than anticipated, and the urban fighting promised to be even bloodier than the beach assaults. Radio communications with Admiral Hewitt confirmed that French naval forces continued their stubborn defense of the harbor despite overwhelming American firepower. The complexity of urban warfare became immediately apparent as American patrols pushed into Casablanca's outskirts. French colonial troops had transformed apartment buildings, schools, and mosques into defensive positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that channeled American advances into predetermined killing zones. The ancient Medina Casablanca's old city presented an almost impregnable fortress of narrow streets and thick-walled buildings. Colonel Henry Priou, commanding French ground forces in the city, coordinated the defense from his headquarters in the Colonial Administration Building. a veteran of the Battle of France who had escaped to Morocco after the German occupation. Priou faced an impossible situation, defending French territory against American forces, while knowing that German troops occupied his homeland. The moral weight of the situation showed in his haggard features as he issued orders that would cost lives on both sides. American tank units encountered their first serious opposition. As they approached the city's industrial district, French anti-tank guns, expertly concealed among warehouse buildings, knocked out several Sherman tanks before their positions could be identified and neutralized. The burning American armor sent pillars of black smoke into the evening sky, marking the locations where young tank crews had died fighting for a cause. Many still didn't fully understand. The civilian population suffered as artillery fire from both sides crashed into residential areas. Dr. Sarah Benjamin, a Jewish physician who had fled Nazi persecution in Europe, worked frantically in Casablanca's hospital to treat casualties from both armies. Her medical diary, later discovered by war correspondents, described the tragic irony of treating French soldiers wounded by American shells and American soldiers injured by French resistance, all while Nazi forces controlled most of Europe. French Moroccan troops, fighting for a government that collaborated with their traditional enemies, displayed remarkable courage throughout the urban battle. Many of these soldiers had family members who remembered the French conquest of Morocco decades earlier, yet they fought with professional determination against American forces. Street fighting intensified as American infantry pushed into the commercial district. Every building became a potential fortress, every intersection a deadly crossfire zone. French snipers, many of them experienced hunters from the Atlas Mountains, picked off American soldiers with devastating effectiveness. The urban terrain negated many American advantages in armor and artillery support. According to war correspondent Drew Middleton's dispatches published in the New York Times, the urban fighting in Casablanca represented a new type of warfare for American forces, who had trained primarily for open-field combat against German formations. Captain Richard Stone led his infantry company through rubble-strewn streets toward the central marketplace. His men moved cautiously, checking every doorway and window for French defenders. The company had lost 30% of its strength since landing at Fedala Beach, and the survivors showed the strain of continuous combat against an enemy they respected, but couldn't understand fighting. The political dimension became personal when Stone's unit captured a French lieutenant who spoke perfect English. During interrogation, the prisoner explained that he had studied at Columbia University before the war and hoped to return to America after France's liberation. Yet here he was, fighting Americans because duty and honor demanded resistance to invasion regardless of its ultimate purpose. As midnight approached on November 8th, both sides prepared for what promised to be an even bloodier day ahead. American forces controlled portions of Casablanca's outskirts, but faced determined French resistance in the city's center. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on soldiers from both armies, who fought with professional skill while questioning the political decisions that made their battle necessary. November 9th, 1942, dawn gray and overcast above Casablanca, the Atlantic wind carrying the acrid smell of credite and burning fuel across the contested city. Major General George Smith Patton Jr. stood in his forward command post, studying reconnaissance reports that showed French resistance remained fierce. Despite 36 hours of continuous fighting, the American commander faced a crucial decision: continue the costly urban assault or attempt negotiations that might spare both sides further bloodshed. The French battleship Jeanne Bart, though heavily damaged from repeated American naval bombardment, continued to fire her remaining guns at Allied shipping. Admiral François Mislier refused all surrender demands, declaring that French naval honor required resistance until the last shell was expended. The incomplete battleship had become a symbol of French determination, her crew continuing to fight even as their vessel slowly settled deeper into the harbor mud. In the city's ancient Medina, Captain Jean-Claude Moreau led his company of French colonial troops in a desperate defense of the old quarter's narrow streets. The former philosophy professor from the Sorbonne found himself commanding Moroccan soldiers in street fighting that grew more savage. With each passing hour, his men respected him for sharing their dangers, but they questioned orders that required them to fight Americans, who might eventually help liberate France from German occupation. American Sherman tanks pushed deeper into the commercial district, their steel tracks grinding over rubble from collapsed buildings. Tank Commander Sergeant Bill Harrison peered through his periscope at French anti-tank positions, concealed among the market stalls. His crew had been fighting for 2 days straight, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, while their ammunition supplies dwindled dangerously low. The civilian population bore the heaviest burden, as artillery fire from both sides devastated residential neighborhoods. Rabbi Abraham Cohen, leader of Casablanca's Jewish community, opened his synagogue as a makeshift hospital for wounded from both armies. The rabbi's congregation included refugees from Nazi persecution, who found bitter irony in sheltering French soldiers fighting against their potential liberators. French resistance showed signs of weakening as ammunition supplies ran low, and casualty reports mounted. Colonel Henry Prieu received urgent messages from subordinate commanders, requesting permission to withdraw from untenable positions. The French colonel understood that continued resistance served no strategic purpose. Yet military honor demanded that he fight until ordered to surrender by higher authority. The breakthrough came at 1400 hours, when American forces finally silenced the Jean Bart's main armament. USS Massachusetts scored direct hits on the French battleship's remaining turret, ending her ability to threaten Allied shipping. With their primary naval asset neutralized, French defensive positions became increasingly isolated and vulnerable to American assault. According to military historian Rick Atkinson's comprehensive account in An Army at Dawn, the turning point at Casablanca came when French colonial troops began surrendering in significant numbers, rather than continuing hopeless resistance. General Auguste Nobes, the French resident general of Morocco, found himself under pressure from multiple directions. Vichy government officials demanded continued resistance, while local commanders reported that their positions had become untenable. The general understood that prolonged fighting would only increase casualties on both sides, without changing the ultimate outcome. American psychological warfare specialists broadcast surrender appeals in French and Arabic, promising honorable treatment for French forces that laid down their arms. These broadcasts, transmitted from mobile radio units, reached French positions throughout the city and helped convince colonial troops that surrender offered a path to eventual participation in French liberation rather than permanent disgrace. The most poignant moment came when French and American medical personnel collaborated to evacuate wounded from a collapsed hospital. Captain Robert Murphy, the American diplomat, not the soldier, worked alongside French officers to organize the rescue effort. The cooperation demonstrated that political necessity, rather than personal animosity, had created this tragic confrontation. By evening, French resistance had collapsed in most sectors of the city. White flags appeared on buildings throughout Casablanca as colonial units surrendered to advancing American forces. The sight of French soldiers laying down their weapons brought relief to American troops, who had never wanted to fight fellow opponents of Nazi Germany. General Patton prepared for formal surrender negotiations, knowing that the political dimensions of Operation Torch required careful handling of defeated French forces. The Americans needed French cooperation for future operations against German forces, making magnanimous treatment of former opponents a strategic necessity, as well as a moral imperative. The formal surrender ceremony took place at 1700 hours on November 10, 1942, in the elegant ballroom of the Hotel Ampha, overlooking Casablanca's battered harbor. General Auguste Nobes, representing French Morocco, signed the capitulation documents while American and French officers stood at attention. Around mahogany tables that had once hosted peaceful diplomatic receptions, Major General George Smith Patton, Jr. accepted the French surrender with characteristic military bearing, but his private diary later revealed his conflicted feelings about the victory. The American commander understood that French resistance had delayed Operation Torch's timeline and cost lives on both sides, yet he respected the professional courage displayed by his opponents. The three-day battle had demonstrated French military effectiveness, even under impossible circumstances. The casualty reports painted a sobering picture of the operation's human cost. American forces suffered over 1,000 killed and wounded during the Casablanca landings, while French losses exceeded 800 dead and wounded. The numbers represented not just military statistics, but young men from both nations, who died fighting each other while Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe. Each casualty report carried names, ages, and home addresses that would bring grief to families on both sides of the Atlantic. Admiral François Michelet assigned the naval surrender aboard USS Augusta, formally ending French maritime resistance in Moroccan waters. The French admiral's dignity impressed his American counterparts, who recognized that he had fought with honor despite overwhelming odds. The Jean Bart, listing heavily but still afloat, became a symbol of French naval tradition that had honored duty even when that duty required fighting natural allies. French colonial troops marched into prisoner-of-war compounds with their heads held high, their professional bearing intact despite defeat. Many of these soldiers would later join Free French forces and fight alongside Americans in Tunisia and Italy. The Moroccan and Senegalese troops, who had served France with distinction, found themselves caught between colonial obligations and liberation movements that would reshape Africa after the war. The civilian population emerged from hiding to witness scenes that captured the war's complex political dimensions. Rabbi Abraham Cohen watched American soldiers distribute medical supplies to wounded French prisoners, while Dr. Sarah Benjamin treated casualties from both armies with equal dedication. These acts of humanity amid warfare's brutality demonstrated that individual decency could survive even the most politically complex military situations. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's diplomatic gamble had succeeded despite the costly fighting. Operation Torch established American forces in North Africa and opened the Second Front that would eventually lead to German defeat. However, the price of that success included the tragic necessity of Americans fighting Frenchmen while both nations' true enemy occupied much of the civilized world. According to official U.S. Army records declassified decades later, the Battle of Casablanca taught American forces valuable lessons about urban warfare, amphibious operations, and the political complexities of fighting allies turned temporary enemies. The most significant long-term consequence came in the relationships forged between American and French military professionals during the post-battle period. Colonel Henry Priou, the French defender of Casablanca, later served as liaison officer between American forces and French colonial troops who joined the Allied cause. His insights into colonial military organization proved invaluable during subsequent North African campaigns. General Charles de Gaulle arrived in Casablanca 3 weeks after the surrender, meeting with Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to plan the liberation of France. The Free French leader understood that the blood spilled at Casablanca had been necessary to establish the Allied foothold that would eventually drive German forces from French soil. The battle's political ironies became stepping stones toward national liberation. The Hotel Anfa, site of the surrender ceremony, later hosted the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. Roosevelt and Churchill met in the same ballrooms, where French officers had signed capitulation documents, planning military strategies that would lead to victory in Europe. The transformation from battlefield to diplomatic venue symbolized war's ability to create new political realities from the chaos of combat. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who had worried about the battle's outcome during the pre-dawn hours of November 8th, survived to lead his regiment through Tunisia, Sicily, and Normandy. His combat diary, preserved in military archives, recorded his evolving understanding of war's political dimensions and the tragic necessity of Americans fighting Frenchmen before they could fight Germans together. The Battle of Casablanca ended with victory, but its true significance lay in demonstrating that even morally complex military operations could serve just causes when political wisdom guided military necessity toward ultimate liberation.